Hello, and welcome to a new series of discussions with me and my very good YouTube friend, Daisuke Beppu. Say hello.
Hello. Greetings from Tokyo.
Yes, and greetings from Surrey, England. Not quite as exotic as Tokyo, Japan. But regardless, we've decided to do a series of discussions on the films of Studio Ghibli. Now, if you're joining us from his viewership, then I'm Luke from RazorwireReviews. I've been making videos on YouTube about movies for about 8 years now. So it's been a very long time, and you can go back and see those early videos, and they're quite different than they are now. And you've been making videos on YouTube about movies for, has it been a year now?
Almost 1 year, yes.
Yeah. So you're fairly new to the YouTube thing, but I would say that right from the get-go, you were pretty damn good at it. So anyone who hasn't seen Daisuke's channel, please go check it out. And if you'd like to kind of introduce your channel and what you do for anyone who might not be familiar.
Oh, thank you very much. So again, greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu, and I have a YouTube channel called Daisuke Beppu, where I discuss movies, sometimes in the Criterion collection, but not always in the Criterion collection. And yes, so just trying to, very fortunate to be part of this film fan community. And yes, and with people like Luke and others, it's very fun. So thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this great community.
It's been great to accept you into the community for sure. Finding your channel was a great discovery for me, and now that we can actually do stuff like this, it's really cool and exciting. So Studio Ghibli, I think it would be best to start. I mean, we're planning on, I guess, doing all of them eventually. It'll probably take us a very long time to do so, but as we start here, as we mean to go on, I think it'd be best to kind of talk about how we first became familiar with Studio Ghibli. And I'm not sure with you because obviously Japanese, but I know you've lived all over the world. So I don't know when they were making films in like the 80s and 90s, if you were aware of them yet. So if you go into that, perhaps.
Oh, sure. So my introduction to Ghibli was, I think, the film Laputa Castle in the Sky.
Yeah.
And that's the English title, right? So, and the, let's see. So I was living in the US and in the United Kingdom for some time during my childhood, for a lot of time during my childhood, but I would always go back to Japan every year, and perhaps more, because I had family members there.
Yeah.
So it was during one of those trips that I found, or that I was first exposed to this film and the world of Ghibli. And it was very popular, and they still are very popular here in Japan. And ever since then, there have been, of course, the other films that followed, Totoro, and Kiki's Delivery Service, and of course the others. So, and they still remain extremely popular here in Japan. There are always big events. They're regularly shown on television, broadcast television, with a great degree of frequency. So it's always an event kind of film. And let's see, and there are occasionally documentaries and the like, going behind the scenes of Ghibli, the studio, and Miyazaki, and the creative process. And so, yes, so now I'm in Japan, and it's these are films that I think everyone has seen. I would be, in other words, it's probably very rare for me to encounter someone within my immediate vicinity who hasn't seen a Ghibli film. And these aren't necessarily film fans, but these are just people who are or not necessarily into cinema or deeply into the Criterion Collection or the like, but these are very popular and mainstream. They enjoy mainstream success here in Japan, and of course they enjoy a wide success outside of Japan as well. So, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing your views and your takes on this film and on the Studio Ghibli works in general, Luke. So this is going to be very exciting for me.
Yeah. So my first experience with the Studio Ghibli film was before I even had a concept of any animated film that wasn't Disney. Like, you know, to me when I was a kid, Disney, Disney, Disney. This is an old memory I have when I was very young. Me and my grandfather, my grandpa, were sat down watching this film, and it was the last 20 minutes of Porco Rosso. And that was my first experience, but I had no idea what it was. And I'll talk about that more later on because there's an interesting nugget to that story. But that was it. I saw that and never thought anything of it again. The first time I watched a Studio Ghibli film in its entirety was about 9 years ago, and it was Princess Mononoke. And unfortunately, I was a little bit drunk at the time. So I couldn't quite take it in as much. But even then, and it was when Connie was visiting me, we're in a long-term relationship at that point. So, and it was her last night as well. So I was really like, my head was all over the place. We had some red wine at my dad's place. But even still, I was kind of really taken away with this film, Princess Mononoke. And that's why I looked into it. Okay, Studio Ghibli. And that was really the first I'd heard of the studio. So it was really a while for me before I even was aware of them and their movies. But actually, one thing I should ask you is, were you always a fan of them when you first saw them, or did it take you a while to kind of get into them, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I should say that I'm a fan, but I'm not the biggest expert, so I
Yeah,
don't know all the little minutia and detail. But I'll
sure.
certainly do my best. And then as for the was I always a fan? I think yes. I think there were films that I actually enjoyed more than others upon first watch. And so I'm very uh, I was very from the start. I was very into Kiki's Delivery Service. I think from the start I was very much into Castle in the Sky,
Mm.
and I think I grew into other films like Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind and Princess Mononoke too. I kind of grew into, although I did see that in the theater. I
Oh,
did see
wow.
that in the
Nice.
theater. Yes, when it was released, I was in the U.S. as in college at the time, and I saw it, and it was the English dub of the film. That was with Claire Danes and
Yeah.
Minnie Driver, right, and Billy Bob Thornton, right. So that was a great time, and um, it, I guess before we go into the other film, let me just, before I forget, so you mentioned Princess Mononoke. So I remember at the time when I saw Princess Mononoke in the theater in English, and it was a really, uh, I thought it was just out of this world. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and
Mm.
all the stuff that was going on, but without going into too much detail. But
Yeah,
there's and I remember that Claire Danes was, she was the lead, right? Son, right?
I
The
think so. Yeah.
young, the female lead of the film, and she did a great job. And I remember around that time, actually, I was in college at the time, and then I was very fortunate because Claire Danes had actually been to the same college, and so I remember this very vividly. I was around the time that the film was released, and I was in a pizza restaurant where in my college town, and I was just by myself eating pizza at night. So, and I was just alone at a table or something. And then very randomly, Claire Danes just came into the pizza restaurant with a friend or something. And it was, oh, they sat at a table near me. And I thought, oh, this is very interesting. But I didn't think much of it. But then she started to eat pizza. And I just looked over just very casually, just randomly, and then just at the point when she was just eating pizza and talking with her friend or whatever, and it was the like, tomato pizza or whatever, and I just immediately thought of this her character in Princess Mononoke, you know,
Yeah.
and the blood, right? And it was just an amazing. It was such a surreal experience. I was
Wow.
so just stunned by that moment, and I think from that point that sort of solidified the deal for me and Princess Mononoke. I love that film. So uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering because you've kind of moved around a lot in your life, whether you would have been exposed to Studio Ghibli in Japan, more
Yeah.
like you say, very popular. And I think, from what I understand, it came over to America more in the 90s, more than the 80s. I guess it took a while for them to kind of like get like the English dubs with kind of the high profile casts and things like that.
I want to say that perhaps it was, and I could be wrong, but I want to say that when Princess Mononoke had been released in theaters in the United States around that time, I want to say that the hype was such that this was probably the first time that the Miyazaki film or Ghibli film was enjoying a wide release, or as
Yeah, that
wide a
makes
release
sense.
that that was at the time. So there were other films that had been released, I think, in the US of Ghibli films, but I don't know of how widespread they were. So I do recall that there was maybe a VHS tape of Kiki's
Mm.
Delivery Service, but again, I'm not sure exactly of those details. And I think that was the English dub. So I would always have to go to Japan and uh, get access to the Japanese language film versions of those. So um, uh, yeah, so I think it was around Mononoke that the at least in the U.S. They started to enjoy a wide theater releases, but someone would have to double check that for me.
Sure, yeah. That seems to make sense from what I vaguely know about kind of,
Yeah.
how it came over to America. And we're gonna start off with Porco Rosso, which is a 1992 film, I believe. And my introduction to it, as I just said, was the first kind of glimpse of a Ghibli film I'd ever seen. So when I saw that, I vividly remember as a child the shot of Curtis kind of up on the cliff on Porco's Island, kind of balancing between the two pieces of rock, and then the dogfight at the end. And I'll never forget this. We're watching the dogfight with the two planes at the end of the film, and suddenly the two characters start just throwing stuff at each other. And no, I think Curtis shoots his plane, and Porker looks at him and goes, "You bastard!" And I was like, "Oh my god, did I just hear someone swear in a car?" I looked at my grandpa, and he just looked at me like, "Oh, there you go then." And so for like 15 years, I always thought of that film with the ugly fat man who flied a plane and who swore. And I had no idea what it was. So flash forward, I think it was 2013. I decided to do this project on my channel called Michael Keaton Month. He's always been my favorite actor, and I thought I want to sit down and watch every film Michael Keaton has ever been in, and every day of the month review one of those films. So I was looking through his filmography and I saw a film called Porco Rosso. And I thought, that's a strange title compared to all the other ones. So I looked into it, and it said that it's about this seaplane pilot who looks like a pig. And I thought, is that the film? Is that the one I saw when I was a kid? So I put it on, and it was. And I was just like, it was like this weird kind of, it was like I had had a concussion, and was getting memories back as I'm seeing this thing again. Although I realized I hadn't seen the full film before, and there was no swearing in it. And so I thought, wait, did I imagine that? So this became a whole obsession with me for ages until I actually found a version of the film in English that did have the swear word in it. So I wasn't completely crazy. It wasn't a Mandela effect thing. But again, so that was like the first time I sat down and watched a Studio Ghibli film sober and aware of everything that was going on. And it was the English dub with Michael Keaton, which I think Disney did in the early 2000s, which is now like the widely distributed English dub. And I completely fell in love with the film, and that to me just took me off into discovering all of the other ones and saying to myself, okay, I need to see more of this because that was really something special.
How old were you again when you first saw
I'm,
Porco Rosso? At least that clip of it, as you
yeah,
remember it.
yeah, I think we were just channel hopping and it came on and we watched the last half hour, 20 minutes. So I would say probably around 7, maybe 8, around that age, I think. So yeah,
Wow.
and then I would have been about 25 when I watched it like properly for the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's great. And then so and I think you're going to get into this more in detail when we talk about the film in a few moments. But
Yeah.
what was I mean, I can only imagine just the kinds of feelings that must have been going through your head when you rediscovered the film, and just all that stuff that maybe all those memories must have been flooding back It's I really am jealous of that kind of experience. That's really wonderful.
Yeah, I will say though, like you would think that that kind of nostalgia for that memory would kind of override things. And at first, I thought that that was why I loved the film so much, just because it connected me to that memory. But as more time has been removed, I really do just love it for the film that it is, with that memory out of the equation. But that memory is the nice cherry on the top, like a nice kind of link with again, my grandfather, he passed away many years ago, so it's a nice kind of memory to link with the film. But as the film itself, I love it.
Wow, that's great. And so let me ask you then also, just before we go forward. So you said you also were able to find out information about that original English language version that you
Yeah.
remember seeing it when you were 7?
Yeah, it's called the Streamline dub. There was a company called Streamline who did a couple of dubs for Ghibli films, but apparently Streamline didn't make the dub, they just distributed it. There seems to be kind of like, there's not much information online as to where that original English dub came from, but there is a part where he says, "You bastard," and so on and so forth. It's generally considered to be a not very good dub at all. And I have a copy of it somewhere, but I've never really watched it.
Oh,
I just wanted to
wow.
satisfy my. I really thought like I was going crazy and that I'd had this fake memory or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow, that's great. Wow. Wow, fantastic. That's fantastic. And then is it how should I put it? Is the English version the one that you're generally most familiar with, the one with Michael Keaton as a star, or do you have experience with the Japanese version?
That leads in very nicely to what I was going to touch on next. I obviously watched that English one first because I was doing the Michael Keaton month, so I wanted to hear him give the performance in the lead role, and it was kind of like imprinting. It's like, okay, this is the one. Like, this is my version, and I'm always strictly original language. I'm really kind of like almost militant about it. Like I always want to go with the original language. But it's a really good dub, and I did watch the Japanese version, and I didn't like it as much for some reason. So I've always stuck with that English version. And last night I actually watched the Japanese version for the first time in many years, just to kind of brush myself up on it, and also to pay attention to the dialogue and see the differences. And I've took down some notes, which we'll get into near the end, because there's just some fun differences between the dialogue. But yeah, I would say the English version is the one I'm a lot more familiar with than the Japanese.
Oh, that's really good to know because I'm more familiar with the Japanese version than I am with the English version. I've only seen, um, at least up till recently, I've only seen the English version in excerpts. So I've never seen it actually in full.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and or in one sitting anyway. I've always seen it, all of it, but never in one full sitting. So
Yeah, yeah.
until very recently, for this, in preparation for this, in fact, and
Do you remember
I've
when
never
you?
seen the original, this earlier dub that you mentioned. So
No.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't even
very
know
curious.
like how we found it on TV. I guess it just seems like quite a random event, but there you go. It happened, I
Interesting.
suppose. Do you remember when you
Interesting.
first saw this one?
Yes, I do. I saw it actually on a Japanese videotape,
Ah,
VHS tape.
nice.
And again, this was from my travels to Japan when I was living in
Okay.
the US or the UK at the time. And so my relatives in Japan would always be very generous and give me some gifts of VHS tape here and there because they knew of my interest in film. And this came up one day, and it was in a hard VHS, one of those hard plastic cases that you opened like this and you closed like this, and it had a very nice cover. So it was very different to what I was used to in the US with the very flimsy um,
Ah,
paper cardboard thing. So it was very,
yeah.
yeah. I know it's, what is it called? Clamshell. I'm not sure if that's the right
Yeah,
term.
that's the main style of case I grew up on. In the UK, that was the regular. But I remember when, this is a brief aside, when I was in America, I saw that they were selling some old VHS tapes, and they were all those cardboard ones, which seemed so bizarre to me. But I guess that was the
Yeah.
standard over there, so it's kind of like differences.
Yeah, and of course, the cardboard, they have their own charm, I suppose. But
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
see the clamshell, it's just like a different. It's just a different level of just casing, I suppose. And I don't have that tape anymore, unfortunately. But
Uh,
it was, and I did manage to get over the years other Ghibli films up through Mononoke, and so that was one of them. And I watched it, and when I was in, it must have been maybe early high school years, perhaps maybe a little bit later, middle school. I'm not sure. And yeah, I admit that it was the film that I was most perplexed by
hmm,
upon initial watch. And
yeah.
this is to say that I wasn't really into it upon initial watch, because I thought it was a little bit of a, like, an anomaly in my view, at that time of the Ghibli films. Um, but as time went on, and as I got older, and I revisited it, I find that for me, it's the one that has the most staying power, if
Hmm.
you know what I mean. I think it's aged the best out of all the Ghibli films that I've seen. And I think there is a really nice, how shall I put it? Uh, 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 you use the word nostalgia upon your recollections of your own personal connections with the film, but I think with the film itself, the word nostalgia can be used, and there is a real approach to nostalgia, and a nostalgic look at a time that was very chaotic, but there is a certain innocence in the way the world is depicted, and I think that is a very appealing romantic view that can age very well, and I think it's aged incredibly well, and so much so to the fact that I think it's really just truly lovely and very complex. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it, my friend.
Yeah, so the film was directed by Hayao Miyazaki, who, as soon as I had finished watching Porco Rosso, I was like, right, I need to see every film this guy has made. So
Yeah.
that was my first mission, and I just kept seeing masterpiece after masterpiece. And I guess I'll say right off the bat that it is my favorite Studio Ghibli film, and it is my favorite animated film of all time. I don't think it's the best. I certainly don't think it's the best Studio Ghibli film, but for me, it's a personal favorite. And it just, like, last night when I was watching it, there was just two moments. I forget what moments they were, but I was just sat there going, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm sat here watching this." It's just like one of those films that gives you great comfort. And yeah, so the story revolves around the character of Porco Rosso, which is, I believe, Italian for crimson pig or something close to that. And he is a seaplane bounty hunter in the 1920s. It's set in Italy, but also the Adriatic Sea as well. And so it has that kind of almost exotic feel to it, set in Europe in the 20s during the kind of the Great Depression. And yeah, like you said, nostalgia. For me, I think the main theme of this film is nostalgia. I think that maybe for Porco himself, the lead character, a sense of self-loathing and kind of his struggling with his inner demons as to why he looks like a pig. He's a humanoid pig for all intents and purposes, and it's very vague as to whether he's been cursed or why he looks like this. And I really like thinking about that, like why has he become this way? Why does he look this way? Because he used to fight in the World War One as a fighter pilot, and then when we join the story, he's more of a bounty hunter. He's a bit of a rogue. He's kind of gone AWOL from the Air Force and so on. But yeah, I think the overall film, the way that everything is depicted in the story, is nostalgia, looking back on kind of the days gone by, and that you can see in the way that it looks. I think it's a beautiful film, and there's like a glow to it at times, where you kind of look back on memories, and then also the music, which is a huge part of why I love the film, is the music. And but yeah, nostalgia I think is like a massive part of this film.
Yes, I agree. And I'd love to get your thoughts about that. In particular, what is your uh, view on? Let me just before we go on. I suppose we're going to be talking a little bit in detail about the film now, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, we'll get into
is
it.
is that okay if we talk about specific details? Is
Yeah, I mean, again, we're doing this for the first time, so we're kind of finding our feet on where we're kind of going with everything, but we'll just go all over the place, I suppose.
Okay, great, great. So I guess we can assume that anyone who's watching this has seen the film.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Okay, yeah, I hope so too. So if not, I would strongly urge you to watch the film before you
Yeah.
proceed with this video. So there's a lot of great riches to the film. But for those of you who have, I guess I wanted to ask you, Luke. Um, what is your take on the character of Porco Rosso himself? How do you feel about his treatment? You alluded to the uh, the the reference to the fact that he might have been cursed,
Hmm.
and there is, I think, only one, or there's one direct reference to the fact that he was cursed, right? Because that was something that Gina had
Yes.
mentioned when he goes to the restaurant for the first time in the film.
Yeah.
Just he says, "Oh, when will this curse be? When will you be free of this curse?" or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. And we never get any more information about that directly.
Yeah.
We do, I think, get a sense of what that might have been, or what he is going through, or why he is the way he is. But I was wondering what your general thoughts about that are. In other words, how do you feel about the the fact that our hero is this what's the phrase, anthropomorphic
Mm.
pig guy, and the fact that everyone in the world, in this world, seems to be accepting of that. There's no,
Yeah.
right, everyone is just, oh, it's Porco, he's so handsome and all
Hmm.
that, and he's a hero, and he's known by the Italian fascists, and he's known among all these people, and there's no mention from them about him being a pig or what happened. And so I was wondering what your take was on that, and maybe what your thoughts might be about what the whole point was of having this main character of ours be this pig.
Mm. I think Miyazaki once said that all middle-aged men are pigs. That was some kind of quote, which was no doubt a glib kind of, not a tongue-in-cheek comment. But I think with Porco, I feel like when you see his kind of backstory, in that he was a fighter in the World War and lost, presumably a lot of his friends in battle. I think a lot of the reason why he looks like a pig is this self-loathing, but also survivor's guilt, I think, plays into it. I think that he feels like he should have been taken as well, or instead of some of his comrades who were lost in the war. And that's one of my favorite moments of the whole film, is when he sees all of those planes. I mean, that's just an incredible sequence. But again, I think that he probably fell into kind of a cycle of self-loathing, and but to the point where he just doesn't like himself, but he's grown to be okay with that. And he sees himself, because it's kind of alluded to, he's a bit of a womanizer, and he's a bounty hunter. He's kind of he's turned his back on pretty much everything. And I think that that's the way he sees himself. And that has kind of, you can kind of go, oh, maybe it's just that's the way he sees himself, but no one else sees him that way. But then we have the scene where Theo sees him as a human. She's like, oh, wait a minute. Or there's the scene at the end where Curtis is like, wait, your face. So as far as the movie's concerned, people literally see him as this pig as well. And hey, he's called Porco Rosso. But I think that the curse comes from himself, and it's about him. The whole movie is about him accepting himself for who he is. I think, which leads into whether or not he might have broken the curse, which is left completely hanging at the end.
So, assuming that he has turned back human, which is, I think, one of the possible and very reasonable interpretations of that final moment, that final line between him and Curtis as they're hopping on their planes.
Yeah.
Right, you mentioned it. Curtis says, your face, and then we don't see the face of Porco, so we don't quite know what he's talking about, but we can get a sense of what he might be talking about. So, assuming that he has turned human, what do you think was the reason why he was able to turn back human? Assuming that he did indeed turn human.
I would say that it's obviously in the fight scene at the end, Curtis is trying to tell Porco that Gina is waiting for you. Like, she loves you. And he's like, oh, don't be ridiculous. You're just trying to psych me out kind of thing. And he's like, no, I'm telling you the truth. That, I think, is part of it. But I think the real key to it is Theo, who is this character who has just come into his life kind of unexpectedly because he was expecting to see someone else there when he was going to have his plane fixed. And there's this mysterious granddaughter out of nowhere who he initially was against rebuilding his plane and then relented to. And kind of, I think maybe he sees a little bit of himself in her as someone who's very young and very spirited and talented and interested in planes and so on.
Yeah.
But the way that she kind of stands up for him, and I wonder if it's a case of where, Porco clearly has someone who loves him in Gina, but he feels like perhaps, and this is just me just kind of in my head, maybe he feels like Gina is just thinking about who he was before all of this. And in his head, he's like, well, she just loves me because she thinks of me the way I was before. I'm not that way anymore. And so he kind of keeps a distance from her. But with Theo, it's someone who has never known him before. The only way she knows him is as he is. And she stands up for him. She puts herself on the line for him, like in a huge way at the end of the film.
Yeah.
And she clearly is very fond of him, and I think that maybe gave him his faith in himself again at the end, along with the knowledge that Gina is still kind of waiting for him.
Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as Theo is leaving Porco for the last time, as they're all leaving the scene, after Gina comes and there's news that the authorities are going to come in, so she's giving everyone a warning to get away and let's go back to my place or something like that. And then Porco says to Gina, take her away. She doesn't belong in this world. Take care of her, that sort of thing. So the implication is that this is the last time that these two characters are going to see each other.
Yeah.
And right as the plane is leaving, Theo reaches out and she kisses him.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, yeah. And that reminds us of the scene between them earlier, just before the fight, when they're alone in his hideaway,
Yeah.
and she very jokingly says, right. She says, well, "What if I kiss you?
Yeah.
Will that lift the curse or something like that?" And in fact, I think she does kiss him. She's before she says goodnight or something, but it doesn't do anything. But there's that kind of fairy tale aspect to that, and of course, I'm not suggesting that it was the kiss that lifted the curse or something, but there is something to be said. I think there's a lot to be said about what you just said now, which is great. I think, which is this whole idea of generally speaking, Porco seems to have turned his back on the world and thus on being human.
Yeah.
And so the fact that he has this new relationship in his life, albeit very briefly, right, between him and this young girl who's in charge of repairing his plane, that I think what you said, I agree 100%. And then I suppose just to build off of what you were just saying is, what do you make of the tenor or the tone of the film? And this is leading from the idea that first we have this character who is a pig, and everyone is accepting of this. But as you know, in if this were a live action film, I think that would be really weird. It would be so weird to have our main character in maybe a CG thing, and it would just be a pig or something like that, and that would be really strange. And I hope that never happens. I hope that never happens. I think that would lose the entire point. The fact that this is animation, and our character is this anthropomorphic pig is genius, because it's so in keeping with what we see in animation constantly, right? We always see these animals um, that are walking around that they're just walking around like Mickey Mouse or something like that.
Hmm.
And I think Porco Rosso, Marco is no exception to that. And it feels natural because it's an animation film. So I wanted to ask you about that and about just the tone of the film, which is very interesting in my view, and what your feelings are about that. In other words, the tone seems to me to be very lighthearted
Yeah,
and very much escapist. They're for the most part anyway.
yeah.
There don't seem to be too many stakes when people shoot guns at each other. There's
Hmm.
no real life stakes, right? There's no real sense of real immediate threat to life or to one's body. Everything is very much like a play, just play guns and just
Sure.
rough housing and just kids playing. And even when you have the fascist element coming in around the middle of the film, and um, uh, when um, Porco is at Milan,
Yeah.
Italy, and so they're the secret police, I think, trying to chase him around and all that. But even so, all that stuff is very much of a lighthearted fare. Nothing too serious, except for certain parts of the film, of course. But generally speaking, I was wondering what your take is on this tone, especially because you bring up the fact that Porco seems to be turning his back on humanity, thus becoming a pig because of certain horrors that he seems to have experienced in, at least in what we assume to be his experiences in battle during the First World War. So these seem to me to be very directly opposing
Hmm.
tones. So I was wondering what your take was on that.
I really love the tone. It's really light and bouncy, and the way the film opens with the him kind of chasing down the pirates and kind of saving the girls. It's all very kind of fun, kind of almost Saturday afternoon kind of entertainment. But then it has the room to go to those places where it's a little bit more adult. And I think the way that he weaves that into the light-hearted tone is just wonderful. I think because you could take this story and you could tell it really straight. You could do the serious version of Porco Rosso, and that would be a really good film. But what I love is that kids can enjoy this, and I think adults can get something from it as well. And there's these little moments, like you mentioned, kind of the element of threat in kind of the dogfighting and the kind of the bullets flying and everything. There's a moment where he goes to pick up a new gun for his plane, and the kid says, "Do you want these armor-piercing bullets?" And he says, "Look, I'm just a bounty hunter. I'm not fighting a war." And then later on in the dogfight at the end, he has a chance to shoot down Curtis, but he'd kill him. So he doesn't. He just wants to win the fight. He doesn't want to kill anyone. So again, so you have these like ships flying around, the planes flying around and shooting at each other and stuff. But there's this kind of I don't know, lighthearted. I keep going back to, I guess, but I like that. I like that it can be that free and enjoyable and entertaining, and then it can just settle down into a scene here and there throughout the film, like the vision that he had of the planes in the sky. Like that scene is completely serious and beautiful, and then we go back to kind of a bit more fun afterwards. And I don't know, maybe for me it works, and for others it might not. It might be a bit jarring. I could understand that, I suppose, but I just think that it works. And you know yeah, I think I saw an interview with Miyazaki once, and I think he wasn't very happy with how the film turned out, and perhaps maybe he was conflicted with that too. I don't know, I'm not too sure about that. You'd have to ask him. But yeah, it's an intriguing film for a kids movie, if you want to look at it that way, because it is about a middle-aged man who is kind of not really in the best place, I suppose.
Yes, yes, that's a very excellent point, my friend. And I think I would uh, further. I would. I think I completely agree with that. And also it's very interesting too because the film is and I'm not sure what your take is on this, but if you disagree with me, please let me know. But
Yeah,
the film is it's almost like, for me anyway, the film itself is this kind of escapist entertainment for the most part, as you
yeah.
so rightly said, I think. And there is no implication as far as shooting a gun that it would have in real life. So, and that's one of the great things about watching a film, is that it's a way of escaping some aspects of life that are perhaps a little bit too intense, right? And so, what's interesting though, and this is going back to what you were saying earlier about Porco and his character, is that it almost seems to me to be like the film is itself the visual representation of what Porco is as a character, at least how you've described it, right?
Mm,
Because Porco, if he is a character that has turned his back on humanity and the world because of some trauma, we assume, that has happened, or something like that, or whatever the curse was, or I'm not sure, but I think we can assume that there was some horrendous trauma that occurred because of this story that we assume is real with respect to him and the planes, and he sees the trail of death that is
yeah.
above him, and we don't
Scary
even
to
know
describe
it,
it.
what, yeah, it looks beautiful. It looks like a trail of stars or something when we first
Mm,
see it, but when we get close up towards the end of that little sequence, we realize, oh my goodness, these are all planes of people that we assumed are dead, and it's a really horrific moment of realization.
haunting
It,
stuff.
it exactly. And then and I before I move on, I just love how his plane, when it emerges from the clouds, there's that moment when the cloud, I don't know what it is, the cloud cover or the mist
Mm,
rolls off of his plane to give it a sense of physicality. Whereas later, when we see the planes of his fallen comrades, there's none of that physicality. So they're all ghostly mist, if you know what I mean. So I
yeah,
love that difference that and I love those little touches, but of physicality that he tries to inject into his films. But just going back to what you were saying, it seems like if Porco is a character that is turning his back on humanity because of the horrors of the war or something to that effect, and he becomes a pig, then it's and therefore the film operates seems to be operating on that same logic. In other words, we come into the film immediately with Porco already as a pig, right?
hmm
And he is living this life that is very romantic,
yeah,
that seems to be, for the most part anyway, it seems to be free from any uh, uh, major issues about. He seems to be well off, or he seems to be rather comfortable,
yeah,
and and he's flying in this beautiful plane, and he's getting into these adventures and dogfights with pirates and all that, and becoming a hero. But all that seems very it's very escapist, right? And it's very far from reality. It's
yeah.
very far from reality. It's a very light fantasy fare. So that in itself seems to suggest that it's like the film is Porco, if you know what I mean, right?
Sure. It's like, we say like he's turned his back on humanity, but he's still here, and he's kind of living it up, living quite a decadent lifestyle, and
Yeah,
almost running from his problems in that way by, like you say, but in an escapist fashion, perhaps,
yeah,
where he's being very reckless, as this bounty hunter, and kind of just lives each day as it comes and doesn't really dwell on the more serious aspect of life, because like
yeah,
I think he's done with that side of things.
yeah.
Mm.
Although there is an interesting aspect to the film that I would acknowledge, of course, which is that although there is an escapist element, the film is also very interesting. There's an interesting focus on money and how money works, and how we need more money here,
Yeah,
and we
yeah,
need to
good point.
pay the bills for
Mm.
the plane, and that becomes a big part of the whole climactic battle. there and all that stuff, and how bounty hunters will no longer be able to operate because of a stricter crackdown by the Italian authorities, etc. So there seems also to be this emphasis on money a lot. So that could be a little bit of a little caveat, if you will, in terms of these. In others it's escapist, but there is also this focus on money or real world concerns, at least as far as the money discussions are treated in the film. Right.
And also, like, with the depression, like, that is touched on, the talk about people being out of work and how all the women come in to build the plane, and even just a little moment where Porco and Theo stop to get fuel, and she's complaining that it costs so much compared to Milan, and he's saying, well, these people, they need to charge more because it's a really dire situation at that point in time. So it's interesting that Miyazaki did a story like this, which we've talked about what the story is, but in a way that is set in a very specific point and place, like in Italy, Croatia, the Adriatic Sea, and in like the 20s. So he's taken this story, which could have very easily been of unplaceable, like Kiki's Delivery Service, which doesn't have a specific kind of era or location. But this one, I'm trying to think if any other of his films have actually been set in an actual. Maybe The Wind Rises, right? That definitely is, because that's more of a But for the most part, his films don't tend to be set in sort of very real world, time and date stamp kind of almost to that. I think there's a magazine at the beginning of the film that says like Cinema 1929, so it's very specifically set in the late 1920s.
Yes, that's right. The magazine that's covering his face, right, as he's napping in the right. That is a very interesting point, and I'm glad you bring up The Wind Rises, because I think, without going into too much detail in The Wind Rises, I think that forms a really nice double feature with this film, and the characters in that film, I think, are real. They form a nice parallel with Porco and Gina and Theo here. I guess maybe if I could, I'd love to get your take on these other characters that we see in this film. I guess I'd love to get your take on, for example, Theo, who I think is the other major character. Well, there are other major characters, but she, I think, and the relationship between her and Porco is one of the key relationships in the film, as I think you've pointed out earlier. So I wonder what you thought about her character and how it figures in, and the relationship that plays out between her and Porco.
I love her character. I love her kind of spirit, and her energy. And it almost kind of, whenever I see the film, it makes me feel like, man, I should kind of approach the things that I love with that much kind of passion and kind of, focus. And, how she stays up all night kind of drawing up the plans for the plane and stuff. And it's definitely, I think, a staple of Miyazaki's work to have a really strong female character, which, these days in Hollywood movies is kind of like, it's almost like a notable thing, 20, 25 years. And he was doing that then. There have been strong female characters since the silent era, but, generally speaking, it's just a really positive character, which I think it makes a nice contrast with Porco. He's very much this kind of grouchy and kind of, I wouldn't say miserable, but, he's almost apathetic, and then you have this almost polar opposite to him. Who also, as she notes, is like 17, the same age he was when he became this kind of, at least started flying planes and things. And so perhaps again he might see something in her. Now, one thing I want to ask you now, because you've been asking me a lot of things, how do you feel about their relationship as it pertains to a possible romance? Because this is played with quite a bit throughout the film in terms of the Piccolo, who's saying like, hands off my granddaughter and all this kind of stuff. And, she seems to take a liking to him, and he's very much kind of shying away from that. But it is mentioned.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about it in terms of, I mean, it's there, but I suppose I'd never, I guess it would never happen. And
No.
I think the characters would never allow it to happen anyway. And I think Porco as a character would never allow that to happen. So I think it's mentioned in jest,
Yes, yes,
Piccolo, I think, is a little bit of a he's a little bit of an interesting character. He's kind of a comic character, but he's not. He's a little bit of a. There are some aspects of his character that are a little bit, but I think that's just the nature of his character as well. So I think though that, but I think there is a genuine love between Porco and Theo.
yeah,
And there's nothing there. And I think the it comes, I think, from it's like, how should I put it? I think there, yeah, I think the relationship there is it's one of there's a love there. There's also Theo is obviously very much in awe of this character,
yeah,
and also she is very energetic and a very she's kind of an independent thinker in many ways, and so I think you're rightly put it that Porco seems to be in admiration of that kind of energy and drive. I would say also that it's very interesting that at the end with her, I guess it's her voiceover, and she
yeah,
gives her voiceover about the events that occurred after that, right? She ends up becoming the head of the Piccolo.
yeah. That's right.
What is it? They design and they make planes, right?
Yes.
And so it's interesting. So she becomes the head of that, and I think there's a mention where there was a little bit hard. There were some hard times
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something like that. And please forgive me if I don't get the line exactly right, but I think that that's suggesting to me that she was in charge of that company or that enterprise or something during the Second World War.
yeah. That's probably what that's in reference to, I would
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah,
And if that's the case, that really blows my mind because that is an amazing thing, and that I think that lends itself very nicely to a thematic discussion in relation to The Wind Rises, which I'm sure can happen at
sure.
another
Yeah,
time. But that makes her character so fascinating to me, and I love the film because it handles these little possibilities in a very deft way. But if you think about it, there are a lot of implications uh, that can arise with respect to just that one moment with regard to the character of Theo. Not all
mm,
negative, but there are certain complications I'm sure you can imagine. And
yeah.
so I find her to be very fascinating indeed.
Yeah, and to go back to that kind of that thing I kind of brought up about the possible romantic thing there, I too think that it's in jest, and I think that it's very playfully done. But the difference in the Disney English dub with the Japanese version, because
Yeah.
I would assume that the Disney version would tone down that joking, like wouldn't even go near that kind of thing. But actually, it almost seems to me that they make it even a bit more explicit. I say
Yeah.
explicit, not actually explicit, but more than the Japanese version. There's a line where Piccolo says, hands off in relation to
Right.
Theo. And in the Japanese version, at least from what I'm seeing on the subtitles, Porco replies, that's the furthest thing from my mind. In the Disney version, he says, just looking at her makes me tired.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which to me seems to imply a little bit more than the Japanese version. But regardless, I agree with you. I think it's more of a platonic thing. Perhaps maybe her as a kind of doe-eyed teenager maybe thinks a little bit romantically of him because she's just kind of, again, in awe of him. But overall, I think it is much more of a sweet and kind of innocent kind of feeling between them. That's
Yeah, I think I think. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before I forget, I think I know it's not a perfect analogy, but it reminds me in many ways of the relationship in the film, Leon, the professional.
yes.
But I appreciate that that's not a perfect analogy, but there are some aspects that I think are similar. But
And I'd like to just jump in there because it's a perfect segue. One thing I really want to do that I haven't done yet is watch the film in French. I don't know if you know this, but Miyazaki has said
yeah,
that his preferred version of the film is the French language version. And Jean Reno does the voice of Porco Rosso. And by all accounts, people say he's fantastic as Porco Rosso, and just having that kind of European language while watching the film gives it more of a flavor that is appropriate to the setting, I suppose, even though it's not Italian. So, yeah.
Yes. Thank you for reminding me. Jean Reno. That is the perfect. I think that is the perfect coupling of voice and character. Jean Reno and Porco Rosso. Yeah, that's amazing. And then just going back to this whole thing about how Theo is treated in this world, and she's young and yet she seems to be, at least in jest, or maybe I don't know. There's at least some reference to some kind of, there's something there, right? And I think though that it's played out much more it's playful, I understand, but it's played out much more in the whole thing between her and Curtis.
Yes.
Yes, which is a very let's go to Curtis now, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And because Curtis seems to fall in love with her, and that forms the whole impetus for the final climactic battle between him and Porco. Because if Porco loses, then and Theo has to marry Curtis, and if Curtis loses the fight, then he has to pay for all the bills outstanding for the plane. So, but right, yeah, Curtis falls in love with Theo, and that becomes
very
and
quickly.
then yeah, very quickly, of course, and then it's gone very much after that. But that I think leads into Curtis and what you make of Curtis as a character, the American.
Yeah, well, but just before, because I hadn't thought about this, but if you look at the way that is positioned, that final fight, where okay, where you have the money, and then you have Theo offered up as kind of the two goals of this dogfight. It's a very typical kind of, the girl's kind of hand in marriage is at play here, but in this case, Theo has offered herself up to this. She is very much kind of staking her life on this. I hadn't really thought about that way, because it's a kind of a typical scenario you see in certain stories where a woman is dragged into the picture and is kind of placed as this object, whereas she is kind of very much putting herself in that place because she's quite confident in Porco. But yes, Curtis, I think that, again, me watching the English version all the time, the voice performance by Cary Elwes is not the best. He's quite over the top. He does quite an over the top American accent, which is, it's fine. It's fun. It fits the kind of lighthearted tone of the film. But overall, I think it's the weaker element of the English version. But I like Curtis. I think he could have very easily been a one-note villain. But I love his kind of pompousness, where he has his kind of sights set on Hollywood and, being the president. Like, his head is so far in the clouds that it's kind of perfectly fitting that he's a pilot. I enjoy him. He's kind of a fun kind of, dastardly villain character who you don't take too seriously, I think.
Yes, I agree. And I too agree about the English version. I find that to be the weakest element of that.
Yeah, for sure.
And the Japanese version has a much more it's obviously a Japanese person providing the voice for this character, who's acknowledged as being an American. So there's no, and the Japanese doesn't make any effort to
right. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, it's there's no added, how should I put it, like accent or anything to make the suggestion that he is an American. It's just a very natural, stern sounding Japanese voice. So
yeah, it's kind of a conceit of certain films where it's set in another country and they just use the language of the country of production, and also I forgot, I was going to say earlier that as far as animation goes, certain conceits are also made as far as Porco being a pig, like you were saying about it wouldn't work as a live action film. And I may say this again as we go on through this series, but the one thing I love about animation is that when you're doing a story with a fantastical element, the way that it looks is the same as everything else. In a live action movie, it's, that's the live action stuff and that's the CGI, or that's the visual effect. In an animation, it all looks the same. So you can get lost so much more, I think, in those kind of fantasy elements, because it's not jarring and taking your eye away from the fact that it looks different to everything else. But yeah, I just want to get that out there because that's kind of one of the main things that I love about animation. And yeah, so Curtis, for sure, in the English version, a lot weaker than the Japanese version. I'd be intrigued to see how his French counterpart does, actually.
That's a very good point. I don't know anything about the French version, so but yeah, but he's a very likable character. I think he's not unlikable. I think he has a certain sense of honor, and he's not a cheat or anything like that. And I think that's another great thing, right? Because he doesn't necessarily, I mean, he ambushes people, but he doesn't. He also abides by a certain code, and he is very honorable. And at the end, he's very honorable in what he agreed to.
Yeah.
So, and he's also a bit of a buffoon in love.
Yeah.
Right. He tries to propose, or he tries to come on to Gina, but she just completely rejects him.
Just laughs in his face.
Yeah, it's great, and he doesn't lose heart. I guess maybe he's too stupid to realize that. I don't know, but
exactly.
But but that makes him very endearing, I think, to a certain degree. So
yeah, to a certain degree, I'd agree.
Yeah,
sure.
And yeah, and that's interesting too, because none of the quote unquote antagonists of this film are in any way unlikable. I would probably say that the only antagonists that have any real serious antagonism to them, if you know what I mean, are the black suited Italian
fascist
authority spy.
Yeah,
the secret police. Yeah, excuse, not spies. So secret police that are chasing them, but we never get a sense of who they are, and they're just faceless henchmen or something. So and then they leave pretty much early. They appear and then they disappear pretty quickly. But apart from that, all the bad guys that we see are very likable, and the pirates are very likable, and they're seen as a bit buffoonish and cowardly, and that makes them somewhat comic and more endearing, and their relationship and how they interact with the little girls at the beginning. But it's all really, and then Curtis is, I think, in a very similar way. So that's a very interesting thing as well. The evil in this film, if you want to call it that, or the bad guys in this film, are not really bad guys. So that lends very nicely to the whole escapist element, and this is not necessarily a reflection of the horrors of reality. So this is a film that, like Porco, is living a very romanticized version that is, while removed from reality, is still very, very appealing. Yeah.
I think that a common comparison people make with Porco to movie character, or at least a movie star, is Humphrey Bogart, in the sense that he has the kind of the trench coat and stuff, and just in general that feeling of old Hollywood almost. There's a scene where he's watching an old movie in the cinema, and again, romanticism. When I think of like Casablanca, I think of like romanticism, and kind of again almost heightened sense of reality, and that's another thing I love about the film, is that kind of that tone of many years ago when things were a little bit more, almost like the grass is greener, I suppose.
Yes.
And again, I've already said that I feel like that's kind of the main theme of the film, is just kind of the nostalgic look back at days gone by, which is neatly kind of summarized at the end when we have that kind of epilogue where Theo is talking about how even Curtis, fondly remembers that summer back in the the 20s and stuff.
Yes. The what was the song that's used?
I'm not sure.
Le temps de cerises, right? The time of cherries.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
So that's another harkening back to some long lost past, I suppose. That's a beautiful song, by the way. I love how it's used in the film.
Yeah. That's actually one of my favorite parts of the English version. I think it's Susan Egan who does Gina's voice and also sings that song, and I think that I love her rendition of it. It's actually a funny bit in the behind the scenes of the making of the English dub where she's talking about recording that song, and she's like, okay, so the original movie is Japanese, I'm doing the dub in English. my character is Italian and I'm singing in French. It's just quite a mix of
Yes,
languages there.
yes. But and then the original the Japanese soundtrack is also the voice actor of Gina,
Hmm.
right? So what's her name? Tokiko Kato is also doing the singing of that song, and it's in French. And so and she is a singer as well. So there's a
Okay.
really it works so well in Japanese,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's that's such a popular song. I think it's performed occasionally on television even now.
Oh wow.
So yeah, that's a lovely song. And Gina is a great character herself. She doesn't appear very much, but
True. True.
yeah, I love how I love how her I mean she's had a really rough
Yeah.
life,
Yes.
really
To
rough
say the
life,
least.
and yeah, and I think right when we see her, she just found out that her husband, her latest husband,
Mm.
was found dead, I think, or something like that,
Yeah,
and
he'd been missing for a few years. And
that's right.
there's a line where she's like, I don't have any more tears left to cry at this point, you know.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's correct, and so it's amazing just how much character is revealed in just a couple of lines, and we get so much, and we don't get any over dramatic portrayal of Gina at that point,
Sure.
because of the line, as exemplified by the line that you just recalled for us, about how she doesn't have any more tears to cry. So
Yeah, I mean, she's just sung at the hotel, and she seems fine, but she's just learnt that her third husband has been found, and so she's used to summoning that strength to put on that kind of a front, I guess. And in a way, both her and Porco, I guess, have been through a lot, but in different ways, and they both have their different ways of dealing with it as well.
yes, I guess um, that's one of my favorite moments when we first see Porco and Gina together. And then there are some other great moments involving Gina, and she's waiting outside, and she reveals her little story about how she's waiting for
Hmm.
the one that she loves or to appear in the daylight or something. So it's
Yeah,
really those are some tender moments. And are there moments? Are there particular moments in the film that you think are memorable or particularly memorable for you? I know you mentioned at the very outset of this the scene where Curtis is shooting at the plane,
sure.
and right, so that was in a moment for you when you saw it when you were 7.
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder if there were some other moments in the film that were memorable, or that stick out to you as being great set pieces or great human moments or great character moments or something, or great
Yeah,
film moments or music moments or something like that.
for sure. Well, you just kind of mentioned one, and I'll get to that. But one micro moment that I love, and I love it when any animated film does this, because you always think like, why would an animated film animate something as seemingly pointless as this? It's when Theo and Porco stop to get some fuel, and he's off on the island or whatever, getting the fuel and meeting a few people at a bar, and then Theo is just sat on the plane waiting. And she sat there like that with her hat, I think, just kind of, bored out of her mind, eyes closed. And a little fly just comes in, buzzes
Mm,
in, lands on the plane, and she just kind of blows it off. That's it. Like, that shot doesn't need to be in the film. It has no business being in the film, but it just
yeah.
adds the kind of human element where it just rounds off the character. I don't think it's vital, but I love when just those tiny details. I mean, the shot's probably like 2-3 seconds or something, but it adds a lot. Not that I'm saying that that's a huge moment, but for me, it stuck out when I watched it last night. Like, that's just a great touch, I think. But one of maybe my favorite moment of the whole film is that moment where Gina is talking about the bet and how she's waiting for Porco, and he flies past, and so she goes outside and he does the loops, and oh man, it's just such an amazing moment because she's remembering what it was like when she was younger with him, flying his first plane. And it's just it's a masterpiece of a scene. And a lot of it is to do with the music, I will say. And I think that piece of music for that scene is one of my favorite pieces of music in anything ever, because that piece of music to me sums up nostalgia completely. It starts off very kind of sentimental and just I'm remembering kind of nice memories, and then it builds to this kind of celebration of nostalgia where you fully picture it in your head, and it's beautiful, and you're like, what an amazing time that was. And then it builds down again, it kind of goes down, and then you're left with that kind of melancholy, like, oh yeah, that happened before and it's gone now. It's bittersweet. Kind of, I love that whole scene, even down to the editing where it's zooming in on her eyes and kind of the flash frames of like the water, and then she surrenders herself to the memory, and we see kind of them flying together. As a scene, as her remembering that is really nice, but I just think that the music can be applied to anything that you think of in your life, where it's just like remembering a really great time in in your younger years, and then kind of relishing that, and then slowly coming out of it and kind of feeling a bit bittersweet. It's a shame that time has gone, but it's so nice that I have that memory.
Yes, and that scene that you bring up, I'm so glad you're bringing it up, because that also shows us the power of Miyazaki's storytelling.
Yeah.
Because there's no dialogue. It's all powered by image and music alone. And we get so much of their relationship in the space of those few seconds, right? Because we get the two of them. We assume it's the two of them when they're very young, flying this plane for the first time. And so we get, I guess his name was Marco at the time. So Marco's fascination for flight at an early age. We get Gina, and they knew each other from a very early age. And we don't see his face. We always see her face, and there's a fascination and fear and thrill and excitement in her face, and it's all registered as beautiful. And then we don't see his face until he turns, and then wow, it's the first time we're seeing him young like this, and that's great. We've never seen him. I think this is the first time we see him as a human.
Yeah, there was in the scene when they
there's
a picture. Yeah, that's the only thing, but it's like scribbled out, so you don't really.
So that, I think is that the first time that we see him?
Time,
and so that's a really big moment. And then at that very moment, I think that's when her dress flies in the wind or something. So that's great. It shows that there's a little bit of a relationship there that is perhaps something more than just a friendship, if you know what I mean. So this is it, and it finishes. That's all within the space of a few seconds. So that
exactly
shows how wonderfully economic Miyazaki's filmmaking is at this point. It's incredibly everything is so dense. And he packs each moment with so much meaning and significance.
And yet you go from a moment where, you have Curtis very bombastically stating he's going to be president, and Gina laughs in his face, and it's all very lighthearted. And then you just slide right into one of those moments that has so much resonance. And then we get back to it again where, Theo is teasing Porco over Gina, So I think it really effortlessly drops in those moments that have so much weight, but at the same time it never feels like it's diverting too much to seriousness.
Yes.
But again, the score, and I probably always pronounce his name right. How do you pronounce Joe?
Hisaishi. Yes,
Hisaishi. I thought that might, because I always say Hisaishi, which is obviously the incorrect, but regardless, I think that he is an amazing musician and composer, like next level, and this is one of my favorite scores of any movie. I think it's really underrated, from that theme to the kind of the haunting kind of background music we hear when he has the vision of the planes in the sky, the more kind of upbeat stuff at the beginning when Porco's flying off to take on the pirates and save the girls, and then just like the piano stuff, that again it just evokes nostalgia. Take a shot every time I say nostalgia in this video. It's just, but it just keep going back to that word, I guess. But what do you think of the score?
Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Joe Hisaishi
Mm.
is very his the flavor of his music and the way that his music lends itself so charmingly and so appropriately to the image, I think, is a lot of what makes Studio Ghibli films so great.
Yes, I
Um,
agree.
because how should I put it? There is an ease of entry into the world because of the music.
I agree.
Uh,
It's a great way of putting
it's
it.
very pleasant to the ear. It's very easy to digest, very easy to absorb. There are no there isn't a lot of discord of those clashing chords or something like that. So everything is very pleasant. So on the one hand, it might seem therefore to be very much simple, and it might seem a bit too overly simple to some people. And I can perhaps understand that approach or that criticism. But I think what you're saying is very important because there is a lot more depth and a lot of activity that's going on. In particular, for example, in the scene that you were mentioning about the flashback and how
Yes.
things build and then they gradually die down again. But there are different layers that are going on just within that particular sequence.
Yeah.
And the we spoke about the tones and the differing tones in the film and the narrative. And I think that can be said very, very appropriately to the musical score as well, because there's a lightness in tone, at least in the beginning, with some of the themes that are used, and the whole thing with Porco's theme and the stuff with the pirates and Curtis and that light kind of uh, fun escapist fare. It's not menacing. It's just, but it's
Yeah.
exciting. It has a nice beat. But then it's contrasted very nicely with the very somber sound, the very sad, slow, and haunting melody, and the those moments that I think Hisaishi does very nicely. And I like that because there isn't too much of one thing or the other. I think there's a lot of there's a nice balance that's taking place.
Yeah. And that scene, not to harp on it too much, but the Gina memory scene, if you take the visual that Miyazaki has constructed, I think that is,
Oh yes,
like you said, brilliant. Then you take that music and you just put them together and it just creates something just it's lightning in a bottle stuff for me personally. I think that's the scene whenever I watch the film I can't wait to get to again, because I just love it. I think it's great.
yes, that's a very interesting point, right? Because you mentioned that there is a zoom in into Gina's face and it
Mhm.
cuts to a shot of the water, uh, and then it goes back to Gina's face, and then it fades into the water,
Yes,
and
exactly.
then
Yeah, yeah.
right, and then so that, and then at the precise moment, the music tends to be like kind of building. I'm not sure if it's
Yeah.
strings, perhaps, but it's building, and it suddenly uh, explodes. And I think the timing is just right. So it's almost like the
Yeah.
music is is this. Audio or oral representation of of a fade into of a memory of the past.
Yeah.
And so I think in that way, there's that moment is perhaps the the best or one of the best uh, uh, joinings of music and image. It's almost like the music is a representation of the fade into a flashback memory. It's amazing.
Exactly, and that's a great point you mentioned. It's a zoom in on her face, and then it cuts to the water. It
Yes,
almost as if the memory is trying to like go, "Hey, I'm here, come."
yes,
And then she decides to relent, and then she fades into that memory and gives into it fully, which is a little bit how it works sometimes. Maybe not completely visually in real life, but you kind of go, "Oh yeah, that thing," and then you go, "Okay, I'm just going to think about that a little bit more and kind of get the fuller picture in my head and things like that, I
yes,
suppose." And
yes, yes,
we can't go without mentioning that Miyazaki in general is such a huge lover of flight. I think the peak of him doing that is just the whole film is full of planes and clouds and beautiful imagery of planes flying, and whether it's flying to get somewhere or flying around each other, like even the flashback where he's talking about the dogfight he got into where all his friends were killed. Just the planes flying around each other, it's almost kind of like a ballet, even though there's explosions going off, which I don't think you even hear. Lots of beautiful imagery of flying and flight and things like that.
Oh
Uh,
yes, and I'm far from being so I'm not at all into aviation, and
sure,
I
yeah,
don't
me
know
either.
anything about
No,
aviation and flying and airplane models. But I understand, and even if I were to hear model names, it never sticks. And that's
sure.
nothing against aviation. It's just I can't I don't understand. Um, I don't know the specific details as far as
I think
aviation
I
goes,
think you'd
but
have I think you'd have to have a passion as high as Theo to kind of really get into that kind of thing and retain all
oh,
that knowledge, you know.
yes, or Miyazaki, yeah, for that
Sure, yeah,
matter,
yeah.
right? Because I understand that there are a lot of specific models that are referenced in this film.
Mhm.
I think so. Anyone who is into aviation will probably have uh, much deeper comments on this than I'll ever be able to make, and I'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
But my understanding, just very generally, just based on my terrible base knowledge, which is next to nil about aviation history, I understand that there are a lot of specific references made in the film to
Yeah.
special models of of plane that were flown by different people, right? Because there are different models that are of planes that are being shown in this film,
Yeah.
and so these I think are based in reality, or at least in aviation history. So aviation buffs, I think, would just love this film. So
Yeah.
much, and I think there are also references to moments of aviation history, certain championships or competitions that took place. So there are
The
little
Schneider Cup.
details like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's all adding to the realism,
Yeah.
those moments of realism while still creating this sense of escapist entertainment. So that's another element I think that lends itself very nicely to uh, um, this idea that we were talking about earlier, which is the differing tones, if you will, things that are borrowed from elements of reality that are used in this otherwise fantastic story. So I think the aviation elements are certainly a part of that. So
Yeah.
any aviation buffs out there, I think would have just a ton of stuff to say about the planes that are being featured here. That's for sure.
Yeah, more than likely for sure. I mean, again, I think of The Wind Rises as well because that's
Mm.
hugely about aviation as well. But yeah, I love that it kind of celebrates his love of that, and it's a very romanticized view of the world, kind of just flying around through perfect white clouds in a seaplane, you know, without a care in the world, kind of thing. So it's always fun for me to escape into that world, and that's one of the main reasons I love it so much is that I just love all the locations. You know, I love the hotel Adriano, just this kind of hotel on a little island. You know, kind of the moonlight coming down at the beginning of the film, and you know the dingy old theater watching a silent cartoon. Just I love all the yeah again the locations really and the way that it's kind
Yeah.
of very much informed by like Croatia and Italy and that kind of area in that period as well. So
Yeah.
I just love the look and feel of that world. Sometimes I'll get a question on YouTube saying like, if you could go into any film, what would it be? And most people would expect like Star Wars, Blade Runner. I'm like, I'd want to go into the world of Porco Rosso, kind of
Mm.
just hang out on his perfect secluded island, you know, and just kind of have some alone time.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Wow, that's very interesting. So you really love the world of Porco Rosso that much.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really great.
I'm quite the super fan, I think, of this film.
Wow, wow. Where would you live, if you don't mind me
On
asking?
his island, I think that would be
Yeah.
yeah.
And so and then just enjoying soaking up the sun and
Yeah.
uh, napping on the beach and listening to radio and reading film magazines.
Cinema 1929.
Right, and drinking wine, right? Oh, that's the life. Yeah. And is it how should I put it? Is this how often do you visit this film? How often do you watch the film?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think the last time I watched it was probably about 4 years ago. Um, But the thing I
Before you watched the Japanese version recently, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
which might surprise you, but with me, it's one of my go-to movies to put on when I go to bed at night. I often have trouble going to sleep unless I've got a movie on, and so Porco Rosso is always there. So I've probably heard the first 20 minutes of the film hundreds of times. It's a very kind of comfort movie in that sense. So actually, when I watched it last night, it was almost like, oh yeah, I forgot some of the visuals, because I'm so used to just listening to it as I fall asleep.
And could I ask also what version do you have of it? What do you own?
Very
That's
interesting. So
yes.
I actually watched this film for the first time, all the way through, like I did a few years ago, as I mentioned at the beginning. And it was during the time that Connie, my fiance, was in Japan. So I was like, please, can you try and find the Japanese Blu-ray of it for me? So she went to some used store and managed to find me a copy. And so it's the only one I have that's the Japanese version of a Ghibli film, and it's the Japanese one there. So that's the version that I own. And being the completist that I am, I also got the UK edition because this has like a 8 minute behind the scenes of the English dub, which I wanted. So I thought I'd grab this, and also one I can just kind of throw on every now and again and not worrying about opening up my pristine Japanese copy too many times.
Well done. Well done. So how is the how do you compare the two versions? The Japanese version and the is it the what is it? The UK version?
Yeah, Studio Canal. I think I,
Studio
I think
Canal.
I think I remember reading the Japanese version. It has a slightly better encode, so it kind of
Okay.
it looks a little bit better. But I don't really discern the difference too much. But the Japanese one does have the French audio, so I am kind of intrigued to check that out at some point. I wish I'd done it before we did this, obviously, but I didn't have enough time to do that. But it was intriguing to watch it in Japanese. I have to say it was quite different because I'm so used to the dialogue in the English version, which is obviously quite different. Because at least what the Disney dubs do in the Ghibli films is they retain the essence of the story and the dialogue, but they try and make it match the mouth movements, and so they can't always be exact to the original language, and so there's lots of differences, and in some cases additions as well. One I noticed was that when Porco is taking his plane to Milan, he's reading a newspaper that says Porco Rosso, dead or alive. And in the Japanese version, there's no dialogue. He's just reading the paper and that's it. In the English version, he says out loud, Porco Rosso, dead or alive? Good question. So there's little bits and pieces that I catch, like, oh, it didn't have that bit, or it has that bit. And so there are, but I will say, having a pretty intimate knowledge of the English version and having just watched the Japanese, I think they do a very faithful job to the tone, even, and also a lot of the little character moments, jokes, and also intention of the story.
Hmm. Interesting. And yeah, I think there are all right. I think there are certain differences that, for the most part, I would say are not so major that would affect the enjoyment of the film either way. Like I think Curtis. Gosh, I'm going to get this detail wrong. So if I get it wrong, forgive me. But
Okay.
I want to say that Curtis in the English dub says that he's from Texas,
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
but in the Japanese version, I think he's he says he's from Alabama or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, when he picks up the piece of the red plane when he's looking for some debris as proof that he defeated Porco,
Yeah, yeah.
and he finds that little panel and he says, this is something he sees, he does this overblown thing, and I think he mentions the fact that he's from Alabama in the Japanese, but he's from Texas in the English. But I don't know. Someone would have to check that for me to be sure. But yeah, that's just an example I think of a difference that wouldn't necessarily detract from my overall enjoyment of the film one way or the other. So
Yeah, I did note down a few things, and again, some of them are quite incidental. When he meets the three old women who are going to help build the plane, he's like, "Well, you're not going to help build the plane, are you?" And in the Japanese version, they say something to the effect of, "Yeah, we need money to buy things for our great grandchildren." And in the English version, we're like, yeah, we need some poker money, which is kind of a more kind of humorous take on that, I guess. But one that I found interesting, this line I don't think is in the English version, and it's in the epilogue when Theo is doing the voiceover. She says, "I never saw Porco again." After that kind of, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't remember that from the English version. And I'm thinking in my head, because obviously they talk about the bets. And at the end, it's kind of insinuated that Porco does come back for Gina. And Theo says that she, was busy running the company, but she always goes back to see Gina every summer. Yes. So surely she would see Porco, but perhaps she's not seeing Porco again. She's seeing Marco. Maybe that's maybe the intention there.
Perhaps, yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, and there's also a line that's very famous in the Japanese. I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's something like "Tobenai buta, tada no buta," which means, and this is when he says when he's on the phone, with Gina, after he's been shot down, but he's calling her for the first time, so she's relieved that he's alive and all that, and yeah, she says something like, "Oh, come back, don't do this," and he says, the Japanese line is, a pig who can't fly is just an ordinary pig, but I think the English version at that point says, something like "sorry" or something like that. So it's a very generic line, a tough guy sort of line. But I think that was a very key line in the Japanese film.
Yeah.
Because it goes to the heart of Porco as a character, and also the fact that he's a pig. So there are differences like that in the English dub and the Japanese version.
There's in with
yes,
that.
Please.
I forgot, and I'm glad I remembered. It's when Theo is asking him about, why does he think that he survived? Why does he think he saw that vision? And because he's talking about how he feels like he should have died as well. And I think, in the Japanese version, he says, "The good ones are all dead, and maybe what I saw was hell." Right? And in the English version, he says, "The good ones are the ones who died, or maybe I'm dead, and life as a pig is the same thing as hell." Which I think is a really nice line, actually, which was, I would say, written for the English version. So I think that there are, there's differences, and overall, I don't think it has a major impact on how the film plays. But for me, it was actually really, really fun to watch the Japanese version and to get more out of the different dialogue, I suppose. It's the original dialogue, but to me, it's different because I'm not as familiar with it. So,
do you recommend getting both versions of the film on Blu-ray that you have? Because I have the Japanese Blu-ray, but this is part of the box set.
Oh, I'm so jealous of that box set.
Yeah, but the thing about it is that there are no, it's pretty scant. There's nothing in terms of extra features, at least on this particular disc. So, so I don't get any behind the scenes feature.
No, I think on the Japanese one I have, there's maybe one interview with Suzuki, and you can also watch the film in storyboard form, which is quite interesting.
So I think. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's maybe not something I would watch, in its entirety, but it's kind of cool that they included it.
I think that individual release, the Japanese individual release that you have, is therefore different than this box set release.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not an expert in the releases, so I don't know what everything is. But my understanding, and correct me, whoever knows, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that this box set release does not have, for instance, that storyboard extra feature or the interview. So this has no extra features as far as I'm concerned. I think there's another disc, or there's a book, but so I think if anyone wants to be really completist about this particular film, probably the best way to go is the situation that you have. I think I'm very glad to have this box set, but at the same time, it is not the completest. It is not the most complete package as far as extra features and similar things as far as this film is concerned. So I think you are more complete as far as what you have on materials and the overall experience than what I have.
Sure. I mean, it's a very nice looking release and everything, and but it's very expensive. You know, obviously Connie got
Yes.
this used, and so, but it was still pretty pricey regardless. So
Does it still have the price on the back? Is there a price listing on the back? I want to say it's like 6,000 yen or 7,000 yen, something like
it
that. Which
comes in
is
its own protective sleeve, which I have in the other
yes,
room, and it does have the price on it, but I've forgotten offhand what the price was.
yes, yes. So I think I do have some of those individual releases for the films that aren't in the box set,
Yeah.
and those were, and I got them, I got them through Amazon Japan, so I got a little bit of a discount. But even so, those are incredibly expensive.
Mm.
Incredibly expensive. So that there are what 6,000, 7,000. Some of them were 7,000 yen,
Mm.
and which is nuts, absolutely nuts for an individual release. I mean, I love Ghibli films. Don't get me wrong, but you're paying 6,000 yen for what like the Secret World of Arrietty or something. So and my daughter loves that film, don't get me wrong, but 6,000 yen, goodness. So yeah, so Connie, good for her for getting
Yeah. It's quite.
the film and the DVD or the Blu-ray, excuse me,
Yeah.
in at the price that she did. So good for her.
But I will say, as far as recommendations go, I would recommend the UK version because to me there isn't too much of a difference in the picture quality, and it does have the storyboards. At least that's what it says on the back. So as far as extras are concerned, I think this pretty much has, and it also has the interview with Toshio Suzuki as well. So
And what you said though that the Japanese, so the English or the UK version
mhm,
has the original Japanese soundtrack and
yes,
also the Disney
yes.
Michael Keaton soundtrack, but nothing else?
No, no, the Japanese one has like English, Japanese, I think French, Korean, Chinese, Finnish. There's quite
Yes.
a variety of audio options, but the UK version
Yes.
just has the English and Japanese. But I would
Yes,
say
that's right.
price-wise, budget-wise, you can't really go wrong with the UK version. But if you're a huge fan of the film, and I am, yeah, it's maybe something to look into. But I certainly couldn't collect all of those Japanese releases as much as I'd love to have that complete set. It's so outrageously priced. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And the UK release, that's as of now, that's still in print. That's not OOP or anything like that,
yeah.
right?
They recently released a steelbook version
Oh,
of months
oh,
ago. So I mean, yeah, they're still readily available.
great. Thank you. That's good to know. It's very good to know. Thank you.
So that might be, if you wanted to get the storyboard option, that might be the cheaper alternative for sure.
Wow, we've spoken for a long time now.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you too long.
Oh no, not at
Yeah,
all.
so.
I could go on forever, but and I think you could go on twice as long or 10 times as long as I could because you obviously love this film. But I guess just maybe as a means of starting to wind down, perhaps.
Yeah.
I guess I'd love to get your. I mean, we all know your impressions of this film and your love of this film, but um, uh, I think I should say too that, as I said from the outset, this is one that I said that wasn't. I thought it was kind of peculiar when I first saw it when I was
It,
younger, but
it is a very odd
then
film.
it is. It's very odd. It's very odd, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people who see it for the first time find it odd and find it a bit
Mm.
peculiar. And it. So, would you think that it might take a couple views? If or another way to put it, would you recommend giving this? Would you recommend to the first timer to just give it a chance and to maybe try to watch it a couple times or something like that? How would you recommend this film to the first timer or someone who's approaching this film for the first time?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I would never want to force a film on someone who perhaps
Sure.
didn't like it, but you know, it can happen. And looking back to Princess Mononoke again, I was kind of impaired at the time, but I kind of thought that it was really interesting in parts. But you know, when I revisited that one, holy, like that just it was a whole different experience, which again is different because I was kind of a little bit tipsy at the time. But I think that these films, they do, I mean, it depends how long it is as well. I mean, if we're talking years, then and I'm assuming that was the case for you, then we change. As we change, the films we watch change, even if it's ever so slight. But I think that with Porco Rosso, in comparison to a lot of the other Ghibli films, it's an hour and a half, and it's so easy to watch for me. I think that it would be a film that would be easy to give another chance to, because you're not going to be spending too much time with it, and also it's a very light-hearted. You don't have to. It's not a very taxing watch. So I think it does lend itself well to revisiting in that sense.
I agree. I completely agree with that. And again, I think it's one that ages so well, and it's a film that has a lot of staying power with it. So
yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because again, it's a film that deals with kind of the past and kind of again, just kind of looking back a lot of the time. So it's fun that it ages well in that regard, I think, with that theme of the film. But yeah, for me, it's an all-time favorite movie. So I could always talk about it until the cows come home. But I think it's a beautiful film visually, the music, and just a unique story. And I actually think it was meant to be an in-flight movie, like a short film.
Oh, yes.
And then it was, I guess, Miyazaki got carried away and just expanded it to a feature film, and got distribution for theatrical release. And I'm so glad that he did, because we just get so much more of that world, and it's a great kind of a great story. And apparently he was going to do a sequel. That was
yes, that's right. Yes,
really would have been interesting, but it was going to be a sequel also called Porco Rosso. I don't know how he would have dealt that. I'd love to kind of, obviously it's not happening, so I'd love to have known what he would have done with that.
Yes.
That'd be
and the
intriguing to me.
assumption being that the character would have been older, and
Yes.
right, and the implication that brings with that, and so I think it would have been very fascinating to see. But I think in many ways, and perhaps we'll discuss this at a later occasion, but I think in many ways, the film The Wind Rises serves as a kind of spiritual sequel or prequel or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So I think that could be the successor film, if you like, to Porco Rosso in many ways, perhaps in lieu of a direct sequel, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and as much of a fan as I am of the film, I like it the way it ends, as its own thing, ending on that shot of the garden and kind of the kind of the mystery of the bets, which we can kind of all imagine what happened. And I like that it doesn't explicitly show that to us as well. We can end on that, I suppose, that it doesn't give us that kind of happily ever after Porco and Gina together. You can that's for those characters, like that's their kind of thing, and we can just kind of imagine that. And I think at the end of the credits, we just see the plane flying around the clouds, and it's kind of a nice button on the end of the movie. So yeah. Any other closing comments before we finish?
No, I think you said it much better than I could ever say it. So yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's been awesome discussing it with you, and I look forward to doing more of them. I don't know in what order we'll be doing this. You suggested we start with this one because I guess of my huge love for it, but we'll kind of, I guess, just we'll play it by ear for the next one. I also think there's no real schedule to us doing this. We'll just kind of we'll get together when we can to do the next one, and it'll continue in some form of staggered succession, I think.
But, yes, I look forward to this. This is very fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for taking the time. And yeah, so we'll see you with the next one. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and definitely leave your thoughts down below on Porco Rosso and any of the other Studio Ghibli films. In fact, we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, thanks for watching.
Thank you very much.